All right, today we're diving into something pretty intricate, a belief system laid out in what's known as the Kim Lakefort Compendium. Now, our goal here is super simple. We're just going to map out the core ideas as they're presented to give you a clear, neutral look at this particular worldview.
So here's our plan for today. We're going to start with the absolute foundation, what's called a world of two minds. Then we'll look at the forces supposedly holding things back in the architecture of control. After that, we'll explore the proposed way out in the messenger's cure, get into the practical side with the path to instinct, and wrap it all up with the ultimate stakes in the prophesied endgame. Let's get right into it.
Okay, first up, you really have to get this part because everything else in this system, and I mean everything, grows from this one single idea, that there's a massive conflict happening inside every single one of us.
And here it is, the core conflict. The compendium basically splits human consciousness in two. On one side, you've got instinctive thinking. This is described as being heart-based, connected to a sixth sense. And on the other side, you've got mental thinking, which is supposedly driven by our cortex and what it calls the reptilian brain, a state that relies only on the five senses and is just fueled by fear. This is presented as way more than just a different way of thinking. It's a battle for our very essence.
So let's zoom in on instinctive thinking. According to the source material, this is our default setting, our natural, pure state. It's all about intuition, that heart-based connection, and the so-called sixth sense. To make it real, the compendium points to the innocence you see in little kids, or the kind of wisdom attributed to Aboriginal cultures, as perfect examples of the state.
Then you have the total opposite, mental thinking. This is framed as something completely artificial, something harmful that's been imposed on us. It's said to be driven by that reptilian brain and this constant, nagging internal monologue called the voice's mind. The compendium claims this state, which it says is basically the operating system for Western civilization, leads to something it calls a reincarnation trap, a never-ending cycle of suffering.
So you gotta ask, right? If mental thinking is the dominant state, but it's not our natural one, how did that happen? Well, the answer this system provides is a massive intentional architecture of control that's designed to keep us suppressed.
And this system of control is broken down into four big pillars. The compendium calls them out specifically: spiritual forces, institutional structures, think governments, schools, technological tools, and finally informational control through things like mainstream media.
Now, inside that technology pillar, the source material zooms in on one thing in particular. It claims there's one central device, one key piece of this whole control architecture, and it calls this the electronic magnetic device, or EMD for short. Now, this isn't described like some sci-fi gadget in a box. It's more of a concept, an interconnected system that includes a whole range of modern tech. The source specifically names things like mRNA, 5G frequencies, and AI as being part of this EMD control system.
So, the big question is, how effective is this whole control system supposed to be? Well, according to the source, the result of all this is that a pretty staggering 99% of people are considered beyond the point of return, totally and completely stuck in mental thinking.
Okay, so the picture painted is pretty bleak, but the compendium doesn't just leave it there. It introduces a path out, a way to liberation. And this brings us to the central figure of this whole worldview and the solution he claims to have.
And this is where Kim Lakefort puts himself right at the center of the story. With claims like this one, I am the only one who knows. I am the cure. He's positioned not just as some guide or teacher, but as the only messenger who holds the key to breaking free.
So what exactly is this cure he's talking about? Well, it's not a pill you take or anything like that. It's described as the switch, something that happens inside you, an internal activation. The compendium claims that you trigger this switch by deeply understanding Lakefort's teachings, what it calls the Word, which in turn awakens a hidden potential that's supposedly coded right into our ancestral DNA.
All right, so if the switch is an internal job, how in the world are you supposed to actually flip it? Well, this next part lays out the how-to guide that's prescribed by the compendium. It all starts with a major shift in your mindset. First, you have to fully accept that this core conflict, instinctive versus mental, is real. Second, you're told to completely distrust any and all mainstream information. Third, you have to truly believe in your own power to make this switch. And finally, you have to be constantly aware of the very urgent timeline the system lays out. Okay, so once that mindset is locked in, you're given what the compendium calls the 8 tools of righteousness. These are basically the virtues you need to practice:
love, compassion, loyalty, honor, respect, morals, empathy, and remorse. The idea is that actively using these tools is what builds your connection back to instinctive thinking.
And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, which really gets to the why. Why is all of this supposed to be so incredibly urgent? Well, the Compendium outlines a prophesied endgame where the stakes couldn't be higher. And that urgency is given a very specific, very sharp number. The source material makes the incredibly stark claim that humanity has only 24 years left to make this switch. This number is part of a whole timeline that tells a story of decline. According to the Compendium, 1990 was the year the real fall began. Then 1999 kicked off what it calls the post-human stage. In 2019, things sped up dramatically, and it's all building toward a critical point on the horizon, the year 2027, which is labeled as an end times marker.
So, this entire complex system really boils down to what it presents as one final binary choice. There are two paths, and only two. One leads to the kingdom, which is described as a kind of heaven on earth that you get to through instinctive thinking. The other path leads right back to the reincarnation trap, that endless cycle of suffering for anyone who stays stuck in mental thinking.
And with that, our map of this particular worldview is complete. The Kim Lakefort Compendium lays out a full-blown system, from a core problem to a final, dramatic outcome. It ultimately frames everything as a choice between the kingdom and the reincarnation trap, and it leaves its followers with one very urgent question: which future is being written?